Sugar is the only superfood. Burning sugar is far superior to burning fat. Keto is a death diet. So, Ellen, let's dig into these.
Very controversial. I don't agree with this 100%. I do think it varies depending on genetics, for instance. That's one of the things that we do in Genetic Insights. One of the reports is on carbohydrates, and it tells you whether you're genetically more likely to do well with higher or lower carbohydrates and whether you do well with simple or not carbohydrates. But anyway, let's give Ray Peat's perspective as I understand it. And I've got a lot of quotes for this one because I want to, again, it's such a controversial perspective. We want to hear it from the man himself. But I think I need to explain something else first, which is the whole philosophy of what Ray Peat was teaching. In a nutshell, I'll do my very best. I'm sorry, Ray Peat fans, that if this doesn't, if this falls short of what your idea would be. But the ideal position for health is to have a good, strong, fast but not too fast metabolism. That's what you find in people in a position of youthful vitality and health. That's what is most desirable. That was his perspective. The thing that both destroys a good metabolism and also is usually a substitute for a good metabolism is the stress hormones. So from his perspective, and I guess in a way, even from a mainstream medical perspective, you can either be in a position where your metabolism is strong, providing all the energy you need, or you can be in a position where stress is making up that deficiency for a lack of metabolism. Or I guess the third option is that you can be a state of complete collapse because neither of those systems are working well. And so this is something that I had been in a way teaching for over 10 years because, the Taoist perspective on that is that you have something called qi, which I translate as everyday energy, and then jing, which is like your reserve adrenal energy. And so there's this idea in Chinese medicine that you need enough qi, you need enough like everyday energy. And if you don't have that, then you have to use your backup, which is finite. So this actually correlates very well with the Western perspective and what Dr. Peat teaches about how if your body is producing ATP, which is cellular energy, which I'd say is the equivalent of qi, in a economical way, in an optimal way, which is an aerobic way, for the sake of simplicity, it's an oxygen dependent way, then you're getting a lot of ATP for every unit of food, and you're good. If that process is not working correctly for whatever reason, and the whatever reason is very complicated, if it's not working correctly, then you're going to need a backup supply of energy. And so there's other ways of getting energy from burning fat, from turning fat into sugar, from turning protein into sugar, for converting sugar into energy but without oxygen, which are much less efficient, still give you energy, but they're much less efficient. They don't give you as much energy, and they rely on the stress chemicals being high to achieve it. And so from his perspective, burning fat for fuel, I think that was one of the tweets, right? Burning fat is superior to, burning sugar is superior to burning fat. So burning fat is like a backup system if the sugar one isn't working correctly. Because it is the sugar one that produces the largest amount of energy per unit. Now, there is also ketone bodies, which they are also good. MCTs and ketone bodies, they are also an efficient producer of energy. So it's not to say that fat is always a bad way of getting energy, but he talks about a specific type of fat, which I think will come up in these quotes, which is the much more common type of fat that is utilized and turned into energy. And when your body does it that way, it's dependent on stress chemicals, and it is very inefficient, and it's going to leave you in a very depleted state, and it's going to run you down, and it's going to age you prematurely, and it's going to leave you low in energy. It's going to suppress your thyroid function. It sets up a whole chain of reactions where you have a lot of other things going on that you don't want, which lead to weight gain, disease, accelerated aging, and all the rest of it. And from his point of view, all of that starts from not having enough sugar and not being able to convert that sugar correctly into ATP, which is what you actually want. And so when he says sugar, he's not talking about white sugar. white table sugar, and yet he is. In some cases, he
Right.
was a big fan of white sugar, and I put a couple of quotes in here about from him where he talks about it absolutely healing people. Um, but his preferred source of sugar, actually, in practice, was from fruit. He was a big fan of getting a lot of calories from fruit. And he also got sugar. He was a big fan of milk, so we get a lot of sugar from dairy as well in the form of lactose. So lactose, fructose, glucose, sucrose, those are his preferred methods. But he was absolutely happy with, getting using refined sugar in a way that I guess even the mainstream kind of is on board with, and maybe a lot of athletes are, right? Like generally these days, carbs almost seem like a bad thing by a lot of the community, and yet a lot of athletes are using dextrose, right, which is just pure glucose. So it's not always that simple. But yeah, let's go into his first quote.
Absolutely. Here we go. Sugar is my current understanding of what is most protective against stress. Stress tends to increase your circulating free fatty acids, activating the Randall effect. Blocking the ability to use sugar for energy and increasing the sugar in your diet tends to lower the lipolytic activity, keeps the fat where it belongs, and prevents the Randall shift to fat oxidation. And so it maximizes your carbon dioxide production, which keeps your stress-producing lactic acid inhibited. All right, can you break the whole thing down for us?
Yeah, there's a lot in there.
Yeah.
So first of all, the whole thing, and we're filming the episode on insulin resistance really soon, which I'll break this down into a lot more detail. But in a nutshell, I would say Ray Peat actually agreed that insulin resistance was the cause of a lot of issues. But just as many in the mainstream to some degree now, and definitely on the alternative health scene, insulin resistance is getting really big. And they're right. It is a precursor, it correlates with almost every disease. It is a major issue. The general way of dealing with that, though, is just to reduce carbs as much as possible. So Ray Peat is saying that is the opposite of what you want to do. He says that the reason why your body gets insulin resistant is because of free fatty acids. So free, unbound units of fat floating around in your bloodstream, which block the ability of insulin to get into the cell. So that's what you meant by blocking the ability to use sugar for energy. And then he says increasing your sugar in your diet tends to lower the lipolytic activity. So what does that mean? It means when you increase your sugar, your body will pull less fat out of storage as an emergency backup energy source. Now, again, almost everyone is reading this is like, well, why would I want that? I want my body to pull fat out of storage as a backup source because I want to have less fat in my body, right? But the problem was, from his perspective, when you do that, you are blocking your body's ability to utilize glucose, which over time will mean that you're not able to produce enough ATP from energy, which over time will mean that you're going to be running on stress hormones all the time, which means that your estrogen will go up, your insulin will go up, and your thyroid will go down. And that goes back to the first point that we did, which was calories in and calories out is not accurate. So if your insulin is far too high, if your estrogen is far too high, and your thyroid is far too low, you can consume an amount of calories that would not make me put on weight or you put on weight, Krissy, and it would make you put on loads of weight because it's the hormonal situation. So what he's saying is by restricting sugar and trying to get your body to burn fat as fuel, what you're actually doing is blocking your body's ability to produce energy properly, which creates this chain reaction, which makes you end up in this position where you're running on stress, you're low on energy, you have disease forming, and you can't get out of it anymore because you've blocked your body's ability to utilize glucose, which to him was, the superior fuel.
I think there's also, and we recorded this episode just a little bit ago on hypoglycemia, talking about having the correct macros, a little bit of protein with a little bit of fat with your carbohydrates, and getting that very well worked out so that the body is being provided with all that it needs so that it can optimize what it needs to use at the right time, correct?
Yes, correct. And one of the things that he focused on, and we'll get onto it in a second section, is the quality of the fat is absolutely key. So, as I said, with MCTs and ketone bodies, he was not against that at all. That's great. That's not a free fatty acid. That's not going to block your body's ability to utilize glucose efficiently and produce plenty of ATP. It's the other type of fats.
Yeah. Can you list a few of those, or just give us a quick example of a couple?
The unsaturated fats, so for instance, as well known these days, omega-6 fatty acids. And even in the, I would say that's one of the few things that the kind of Ray Peat type of community versus the keto community can agree on, or the insulin-resistant keto community can agree on, is that omega-6 fats are bad news, and that they make insulin resistance worse, they make it harder to lose weight, they slow down the metabolism. So that's one of the few points that they actually both agree on.
Great. Thank you for that distinction. So then going into his next quote, Dr. Peat said, "I think sucrose has great virtues therapeutically. I've heard stories about fatally apparently injured animals and people who are in the hospital with hopeless symptoms being given a mouthful. In the case of an animal in shock, they would pour a mouthful of honey in its mouth and hold its mouth shut. And in a few minutes, the animal would be up, not dying at all. And that has happened to dogs and sheep and ducks and all sorts of animals, as well as patients who are in the hospital in a hopeless condition. Someone slipped them a jar of honey and gave him a tablespoon of it, and the symptoms disappeared. And dozens of stories like that convinced me that in an emergency of almost any sort, a good big dose of sucrose is very important."
So this is a great one to explain, the first week we said, which is sugar is the only superfood. I mean, that sounds like a crazy thing to say on the face of it. Because, I mean, where does the term superfood comes from? It generally refers to something that's nutritionally dense. So it's got like a lot of nutrients. That's the original people who said, blueberries or chocolate or whatever were superfoods, because they got loads of these other nutrients along with the calories. Even broccoli, right? Broccoli's got almost no calories, but it's got a bunch of other stuff in it. So, however, I don't think broccoli or blueberries have ever revived someone dying in hospital. And I guess that's kind of his point. That, like, literally, it can save your life to get that pure glucose if and when you need it. What's more super than that? I guess that was his position. And yes, white sugar obviously isn't nutritionally dense. I think technically you could make a case that like a molasses sugar, like a very dark brown sugar, actually is quite nutritionally dense. It's got quite a lot of minerals and nutrients in there, B vitamins and stuff as well. So, but yeah, so that's really his justification for it being a superfood, because it can literally save your life.
Beautiful. He also goes on to say, mostly fruits do contain sucrose, but a lot of them contain some free fructose and free glucose, as well as other minor sugars. But sucrose in fruits, the main advantage is that it comes with lots of antioxidants, anti-stress factors, anti-inflammatory flavonoids, for example, and potassium and magnesium. So it's part of a very complex, valuable nutrient, even with quite a bit of like 1% amino acids that can add to your protein balance. But if you're getting good nutrition, then where a person would think nothing of eating a bowl of white rice or a potato, which contains lots of starch, the idea of getting a similar amount of calories from white sugar has been demonized. But if your nutrition is generally good, there's nothing wrong with white sugar. In fact, it's very low in allergens, so it can lower your cortisol when you're under stress. So it has many protective effects.
Okay, so there's a couple of things to unpack there as well. So first of all, as I said, I think fruit he preferred because of all the other great stuff that came with it. It was more nutritionally dense from his point of view. But he's pointing out that, and this is something that diabetics know, that a bowl of white rice or like a baked potato actually has a significantly higher glycemic impact and therefore, glycemic load than an equivalent amount of calories coming from sugar. And yet people would easily eat a baked potato or a bowl of rice. In Asia, it's pretty much bowl of rice with every meal from what I observed. It's pretty standard. Like, that's nothing. But if you saw a person eating like a bowl of sugar with their meal, you'd be like, what on earth are you doing, right? Or even after the meal as a dessert or whatever, it would seem crazy. And yet glycemically, it's not more impactful, right? And so what he says, if your nutrition is generally good, there's nothing wrong with white sugar. I think what he means by that is, sugar does require nutrients in order to metabolize. Thiamine, vitamin B1, which we talked about a lot, magnesium, all kinds of nutrients. So the only problem with white sugar is it doesn't have any of those nutrients in it. That's from his perspective, right? But if you're getting an abundance of those nutrients from other sources, to throw in some white sugar is certainly no worse. In fact, from his perspective, better. It's better than white rice. It's got a lower glycemic index. He's got complicated views on why sucrose is better than starch, which probably we'll do in another video at some point. But yeah, so that's why it says white sugar. It's been unfairly demonized. And the other thing he says about it, so yes, the disadvantage is it's got no nutrients, but an advantage is it has no allergens. And so one of the big things that ruins your health that he talks about as well is the gut. The gut, both in terms of actual toxins going in there, but also things that your body's having an immune response to as if they're toxins. And so lowering that inflammation in the gut is a key aspect to getting that stress response down, which then gets all of the other hormones in a good place and all the rest of it. So it is a key aspect to all this. And if you're eating large amounts of a calorie source that your body also has an allergic response to, that's going to stop you getting better, even if you're doing everything else right. So again, from his perspective, white sugar, it's got no allergens in, and it's a perfect fuel. So again, that's why his perspective, it would be a superfood, even though it's not nutritionally dense with any micronutrients.
Yeah, it's definitely white sugar, has gotten a bad rap for sure. You hear so much that it's one way, like we're hearing Dr. Peat's perspective here, and then a lot of other things that are out there. So it's hard to figure out who's right. I think that's a quandary of today. There's so much information saying both for an argument for both things, whether it's good, whether it's bad. It's a difficult space to be in. How are people how can they figure it out?
Well, as I said, genetics is one thing. So if you are more of a hunter-gatherer genetics, you're definitely going to have more of an issue with refined, relatively simple sugars. You probably, as Dr. Peat points out, you probably also have issues with baked potato, to the same degree, because it's also got a high glycemic impact. So that's one thing. Another thing is that sugar is absolutely bad for the teeth because it's such a good food from Dr. Peat's perspective. It's a good food for bacteria as well. His perspective, I guess, would be that there shouldn't be bacteria in the small intestine, and he actually would recommend antibiotics and other strategies to get rid of them. And the sugar is absorbed way before it reaches the large intestine. So the fact that it feeds bacteria would not be an issue for him, because he would advise basically nuking any area of the body of any organisms that the sugar might reach. Now, the exception to that is the mouth, right? So the mouth, you're going to have some bacteria, and the sugar is going to feed it. So if nothing else, sugar is definitely not great for your teeth. And as a lot of people do not have a pristine, pathogen-free small intestine area, it can create a lot more issues besides. And so I think that's another reason why it might not be a good idea. And it's very easy to overdo it. So one of the criticisms of people who do the Ray Peat diet is that a lot of them end up overweight. Now, obviously, if your whole goal is to not allow any fat to be liberated and burnt as fuel, it's hardly surprising that could happen. And yet it's not inevitable. And certainly Dr. Peat was an example of that. He was never overweight. So the resolution, but the thing is, so one of the benefits of being on an extreme diet, whether it's an extreme, say, fruitarian diet where you're only carbs, no fat at all, or whether you're on like a keto diet where it's pretty much all calories coming from fat, hardly any carbs at all, is that it's very hard to overeat on either of those diets. It's very hard to eat more than 2,000 calories worth of fat. It's very hard to eat more than 2,000 calories worth of carbohydrates. But if you have both, it's so easy to eat a lot of calories of both if you're having both. And so, he did recommend both, although he recommended lower-ish fat, depending on the situation. And so from my perspective, it's like if you're having a lot of protein, which he did also generally recommend, and you're having the right kind of fat with your meal, then are you still going to be able to overeat it? It's possible, but you're less likely to. But that really is the key thing. It's restraint. The other thing is, I see a lot of people, and this is a really tricky thing. So I see a lot of people act as if they already have a optimal metabolism in terms of how they eat. So white sugar is something that may be optimal for you if you have an optimal metabolism. Now, Ray Peat's argument is even if you don't have an optimal metabolism, it can help you get there. And the quotes we just gave are examples of that, right? People dying or animals dying, and it's still very helpful. However, if you don't have an optimal metabolism and then you freely eat as much sugar as you want, and that could be in the form of fruit and all the rest, and you allow yourself saturated fat, which he was a fan of, and you're not necessarily focusing on having a huge amount of protein, it's going to be really, really easy to overdo it. And so I think that is one of the challenges. However, from his perspective, if you are not doing all that and you're just trying to get your body to burn fat, you're going keto, right? Then you are kind of managing the situation, but what you're doing is you're putting your body in a situation, first of all, it tends to deplete electrolytes. I think even a lot of keto people acknowledge that, which is why they sometimes recommend supplementing with them. Second of all, in order to stay in that state of burning fat as fuel, you have to have high stress chemicals. High stress chemicals over time, over months, years, and decades, absolutely are depleting and prematurely aging. They also make issues like estrogen dominance and insulin resistance worse, which are other factors that lead to premature aging. They absolutely contribute to systemic inflammation, which can lead to premature aging. So it's tricky. If you keep yourself in that fat burning state, it will often help to keep the weight off, which is a good predictor of longevity and stuff like that, which is a good thing. The muscle to fat ratio is one of the best predictors of longevity. But it has all those other bad points, which I just mentioned. If you go to starting to have a lot of glucose and sucrose and fructose and stuff like that instead, you have to be really careful when you do it and how you do it to make sure you're not overdoing it, to make sure you're not creating a different issue, to make sure. And I think a lot of people, they're happier to eat like the high calorie sugar diet and not as keen to deal with the hormones. And so I think it is the other way around. I would look at all Dr. Peat's work on hormone optimization first, get the hormones in as good as, this is my personal opinion, get the hormones in as good a state as possible without making major changes to the diet. Let's say if you're used to having keto or whatever, and then consider, maybe I could actually, and this, I think maybe I could actually increase, the amount of carbs I'm having. And I think that would come really naturally anyway, as you're becoming healthier and healthier, as your metabolism's getting stronger and stronger, as your thyroid hormone's going up, your insulin's going down, your estrogen's going down, your cortisol's going down, as all of that stuff, your progesterone, testosterone are going up. Maybe all those things because you're making it happen, because you're supplementing, maybe it's just happening naturally. As you do all of that, then maybe you can follow his dietary advice and it'll actually benefit you and it won't make you gain weight.
Perfect. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. He's going to carry on here within this, talking a little bit more. The most common cause for high glucose is stress, causing unopposed cortisol secretion. So if you don't measure for either insulin or cortisol, you might be doing exactly the wrong treatment to lower cortisol. Sugar is the most powerful treatment, and 2 doctors in France and England in the late 19th century were running terminal diabetic patients. They would eat a normal meal, lots of protein, for example, but their muscles were wasting away even when they didn't eat sugar. They would eat steak, for example. It would show up in their urine as very high glucose, and their body was disappearing week by week. When they fed them 12 ounces a day of ordinary white sugar, as well as a standard meat and potatoes diet, they recovered. So how do we explain that?
It's another example of what I was talking about how. So in this case, he's talking about a type of diabetes which is not type 2 diabetes as we currently know it. So he said the original diabetes was actually a thing that your body doesn't have insulin, and so therefore it can't transport glucose into the cell. It turns glucose into energy very inefficiently, and basically you're wasting away. That was like the original diabetes. And so he's saying with that one, by just giving them the fuel that they need in the form of this, readily available sugar, these people were actually able to recover. Obviously, with what's called diabetes these days, type 2 diabetes is a bit of a different situation where the person is accumulating more and more fat, usually. They're not wasting away at all. And so that's a bit of a different situation. And having that much sugar is not necessarily going to help with that type 2 insulin diabetes, insulin-resistant diabetes in the same way. But I put it in there because it's just another example of why he thinks that sugar is a superfood, because it can literally cure people who are dying, as he says, and has done in many, many different contexts.
Oh, and I do have one question on this topic before we move on to the next section, which is the role of the liver in sugar metabolism and things like that. And just like if there's any kind of, if let's say the liver isn't functioning properly, because I'm a little confused on what that process is and the role the liver does play on sugar metabolism, and potentially if there are any kind of, if the liver's not optimal, not operating correctly, whether that can also lead to weight gain in this whole process of everything that the body does when it's working with sugar.
100% it does. This is an incredibly complicated one to go into, so I don't think we want to do it in this episode. But yeah, the hormone is responsible for making and transforming all kinds of different hormones, including insulin. To some degree, though, of course, it's made in the pancreas, but it's absolutely involved in its utilization. It's obviously the place where the body stores glycogen, but I think the main way that it's impactful is because one of the main things that starts this whole process of dysfunction is actually poisoning. It's an excess of toxicity, more than the liver is able to handle in that moment. Ray Peat very specifically focuses on unsaturated fats as probably the biggest culprit and poison that lead to a lot of these issues that the liver struggles to be able to deal with. But all kinds of other poisons exist as well that will have that same impact. And the poison messes with the hormones, and then when the hormones are out of balance, everything else starts to go wrong. But yeah, it's really complex, Krissy. I think we should do another episode. Hey, I hope you enjoyed that clip from the Rejuvenate podcast. If you want to watch the full episode that came from, just click on the link above. Or if you just want to watch our latest video, then click the link below. And make sure that you subscribe to the channel and like the video. Thank you.